When people discuss the best film trilogies of all time, trilogies like the original Star Wars trilogy, the Dark Knight trilogy, Lord of the Rings, the Cornetto trilogy, the Godfather trilogy, maybe even the 50 Shades of Grey trilogy, I don't judge. However, one trilogy that I always feel is left out of the conversation is the Indiana Jones trilogy. Yes, trilogy, the fourth one, doesn't count. Kingdom of the Crystal Skull is separate both thematically and in terms of release dates, plus it's crap, so I just happily remove it from the equation. But these three original films encapsulate the brilliant fundamentals of what makes a great trilogy. And they're just great films. If you haven't seen them, go watch them, they're just enjoyable. So let's take a look at why Indiana Jones is one of the most underrated trilogies out there. Spoilers ahead, of course. Much like we nostalgically look back at movies like Indiana Jones now, Spielberg had nostalgia in mind when making these films. Indiana Jones is based off 1930s action serials that Spielberg himself grew up with. Because of this, the film is basically timeless. Indiana Jones isn't tied down by any themes or technology or messaging of the time. In fact, it's really just a love letter to the things that Spielberg grew up with, and because of that, it is basically timeless. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. None of these movies are trying to be particularly ambitious, they're just basically modern remakes of older classics, and in doing so, Spielberg's able to make even more accessible classics. The production design, the action sequences, the plot elements, they're all kept at a suitable minimum to keep this story from being tied down to any specific time period. Speaking of which, each of these films are set in the 20s or 30s or maybe even 40s, which is a less subtle hint that these movies are basically based on the serials from that time. In terms of the way these movies are made, they're basically made the same way they were back then, but with the updated technology of that time. Because they're not trying to do anything ambitious with these films other than making fun tributes to the past, it makes the whole film series feel very accessible and very timeless, which makes these films so charming. Most trilogies ironically struggle with the fact that they're, a trilogy, which is where Indiana Jones holds such a special place. It doesn't really care about continuity, so each film is its own self-contained adventure. You could watch the films in any order, let's say 2, then 1, then 3, and you wouldn't be any more or less confused than watching it in a different order. Wait, hold up. Spielberg just wanted to make fun adventure movies, and we don't always need a deep story for them. So the story's always able to give us just enough in terms of plot and characterization. When we actually go into the characters, Harrison Ford is obviously a really likable personality as Indy. He's sarcastic, he's charming, he's suave, he's capable, but most importantly, he is a vulnerable protagonist, making him far more investing to root for. Indiana Jones is still a very human character, but it's his wits and his will that are what makes him so compelling. The side characters are also really fun in this. You get some good dialogue of them bouncing off at Indy in every single one of them. The villains range from moustache-twirling Nazis to a very not politically correct stereotype. Okay, maybe Temple of Doom hasn't aged well. Nor has Last Crusade, given Indy literally gets Hitler's autograph. And probably not Raiders either, because the Russia stereotypes, but hey, it adds to the charm, right? These films just don't take themselves too seriously, and they wrap themselves up by the time the credits roll. Spielberg wanted to make his childhood into a big popcorn flick, and he succeeded at that. Humor and self-awareness go a long way when it comes to a Hollywood blockbuster like this, especially when you're dealing with the kind of vision that Spielberg had. These movies are just inherently made to be enjoyable, they're not made to be anything other than that. So because of that, these films are so accessible, and due to some pretty good pacing in these movies, you're there for the whole of the ride. Okay, aside from the stereotyping, this trilogy has aged really well. These films have so much personality and passion behind them. Like I said, these films were made similarly to the serials that they're based on, with only the slightly glossier production of the 80s really present here. But because of that, these films have a certain timeless feel to them. The action sequences in particular hold up really well. A lot of the stunt work and choreography and effects are still really impressive to this day. Indiana Jones still makes for a really compelling action hero, and all of the set pieces feel really distinct from one another. Sort of hand in hand with that, we have the production design, which is still really good. Whether it's ancient ruins or more modern buildings, these films have a really authentic feel to them. They either feel incredibly ancient or incredibly lived in. The effects, okay, they have aged, but at least they're not present in the films too often, and you can kind of just let it slide by going, well, these films are like 40 years old. And like I said, these films weren't too ambitious with their techniques, which means they can basically use their settings as a shield. This film is set in the 1930s, so why would you apply it to a modern day standard? These films really are timeless. And on the subject of this movie being timeless, we of course have to talk about John Williams' iconic score for this trilogy. I mean, at this point in time, just saying John Williams is good enough for saying iconic music. It's just fantastic, and John Williams' music always ages really well, and this is no exception. I thought I'd take the last segment of this video to talk about arguably one of the more important things when it comes to making a good trilogy, which is all three of the films in this trilogy are just good. So I thought I'd review each individual film and talk about what I really like about each of them. Raiders of the Lost Ark. This was one of my favourite movies growing up as a child. In particular, I really liked the Lego game installment of this. Obviously, this had to be a really self-contained adventure, and it does it really well. This film has a really good pace to it. I really like the relationship between Indy and Marion in this film. I also thought that Salah was a pretty fun side character in this. The villains were moustache-twirlingly evil. They were very fun presences though. We even get a Nazi monkey, which is something that I really wasn't expecting to see in a film. The whole of the opening sequence is just iconic. I really love the action scene set on the road. All of the set design is really impressive, and the direction when it comes to some of these mystical elements is just so atmospheric. Spielberg has a really good eye for storytelling in this film. It flows very well, and I love the attention it brings to characters basically just being smart. The music's great, the camera work's great, the characters are all really well done, and ultimately this is a story that you're just rooting for your characters to win the whole time. It's a really compelling and well-made adventure film. Temple of Doom. This film isn't as tonally consistent as the first one is. Sometimes it's really goofy with its humour, and other times it's really dark and serious with some of this ritualistic stuff. Although not gonna lie, I kinda like it. But this film once again still has all of the attention to detail that works about it. Some really great intense action sequences here. We have Short Round, who I feel is very underrated. We have a really good opening sequence in Shanghai that happens. I like a lot of the ritualistic stuff that goes on that tests characters like Willie, Indy, and Short Round. The action sequences where they escape on a minecart is really fun as well. The finale that happens on the bridge, it's all good stuff. What I will say is that Willie Scott isn't nearly as endearing of a presence as Marion Ravenwood is. She can be quite annoying at points, but ultimately this film is still pretty fun, still has a lot of iconic moments to go with it. People call it the bad one of the trilogy, but honestly I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. It's not as good as 1 or 3, but despite that it's still a very enjoyable action film that people clearly really cared about when making. It's good, don't at me. And if you thought that was it for controversial opinions, well, The Last Crusade is my favourite Indiana Jones film. The relationship between Sean Connery and Harrison Ford just makes the film so enjoyable. We also have Marcus Brody and Salah, who also make for really good side characters. Ultimately, the strength of this film is just its side characters bouncing off each other. Julian Glover makes for a really good villain in this film. We have Ilsa Faust, who betrays Indy. That was a really good choice as well. I love the ending where Indy basically has to choose the right cup. He has all these tasks to go through using his wits and his will and his faith to get him out of the situation. A lot of the action sequences in this film are great. We of course have the amazing tank fight scene in this film. We have the stuff going on in Venice. The scene where Indy and Henry are strapped to a chair while the building's burning. That's a really good moment. Ultimately, this film's just full of enjoyable action sequences. The characters bouncing off of each other is really good. As usual, things like the music, the directing, the production design, they're all top notch. I ultimately feel like the creative decisions in this film are just the strongest ones. But hey, that's just my opinion, and that goes for the whole of the video. I'm not actually saying that the original Indiana Jones trilogy is the best trilogy of all time, but I'm saying it definitely needs to be in the conversation. But anyway, let me know your thoughts on this down below in the comment section below, because this is the end of the video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Check out my Twitter at MrChickenMovies. But for now, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.